I am Anna. I am 29 years old, a journalist living in Portland, Oregon. If someone told me a year ago that my own family would turn their backs on me over money, I wouldn't have believed it, not for a second. But here I am, caught in the middle of a storm that feels like it's tearing apart everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and blood. It started with the will. After my grandmother passed away, I was shocked to learn that I had been completely cut out of her will. My uncle and aunt, her only surviving children, told me bluntly that I didn't need the money. Just like that, no explanation, no hesitation. It felt like a slap in the face, as if I were invisible, as if the years I spent visiting her, listening to her stories, and caring for her in her final days meant nothing. But something didn't sit right with me. I remember the way Grandma used to talk about fairness, about family being a circle where no one is left out. I recalled the little things she mentioned, how she wanted all her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to be treated equally. Her kindness, her fairness, it didn't match the coldness of that will. Late one night while cleaning out her old desk, I found it, a folded handwritten letter tucked away in an envelope with her shaky signature. My heart pounded as I unfolded the fragile paper. Her words spilled out simple but profound. She wanted the inheritance to be divided equally among all her descendants, every last one. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice, about honoring her voice beyond the grave. My hands trembled, and tears blurred my vision. Was this letter enough to undo the injustice? Or would my family's betrayal cut even deeper now that I had proof I knew I had to fight, not just for the money, but for Grandma's memory, for what was right? So, I hired a lawyer. I poured every ounce of my energy into uncovering the truth behind the forged will. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, late-night calls, and the emotional roller coaster of confronting the people who were supposed to be my family. My uncle and aunt denied everything at first, their faces tight with anger and guilt. The tension between us grew thick and suffocating, as if the air itself carried the weight of betrayal. But the truth has a way of rising no matter how deeply it's buried. When the court ruled in my favor, forcing them to restore my rightful share, it wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a quiet acknowledgement of wounds that might never fully heal. The money, Grandma's legacy, was now in my hands, but the silence between me and my relatives screamed louder than any reunion could. With the inheritance, I didn't want to just sit on the money or let resentment fester. I remembered Grandma's heart, her endless compassion for the children she cared about in our community. So I decided to use the money to help kids who had nothing, children struggling just to get by. I wanted to turn pain into purpose, betrayal into hope. But even as I took those first steps, I felt the shadow of the past still looming over me. The family I once knew felt like a stranger's ghost haunting my every move. This story isn't over, not by a long shot. The fights, the emotions, the unresolved fractures, they're all still there simmering beneath the surface. And as I move forward, I have to ask myself, can blood ever be thicker than betrayal? Or is some damage too deep to mend? I don't know the answers yet, but I'm going to find out, because this is my story, and it's only just beginning. After the court's decision, I thought maybe, just maybe, things could start to heal. That maybe my uncle and aunt, confronted with the truth, would finally see me not as a rival to be shut out, but as family blood running through the same veins with memories and shared stories linking us. But healing, I've learned, isn't something you can force. Sometimes it's a slow ache, a fracture that widens with every unspoken word. When I first sat down to tell them I wanted to use the inheritance for children in need, just like Grandma had always cared for, I saw the flicker of something in their eyes, maybe guilt, or maybe resentment, I don't know. Because instead of joining me, instead of embracing what she had dreamed for her legacy, they stepped back further walls, rising higher and thicker than before. I remember the day I met with my lawyer to discuss the next steps. It was a cold afternoon, the kind of gray Portland sky that presses down on your chest and makes every breath heavier. I sat there gripping the edge of the chair, wondering if I was strong enough for what was coming. "You're doing the right thing," Anna, my lawyer, said quietly. "But family disputes over money, they can get ugly. You have to prepare yourself." I nodded, but inside a storm was building, not just anger or frustration, but a raw, aching sadness. I was fighting not just for money or justice, but for respect, for acknowledgement of who I was and who Grandma wanted me to be. Every phone call with my uncle or aunt felt like walking through a minefield. Their voices were clipped careful, like they were measuring every word to avoid some unseen trap. I tried to reach out to bridge the gap, but the silence was louder than any conversation we had. I think the hardest moment came when my mother called me, her voice trembling on the other end of the line. "Anna, maybe you should let this go. Family isn't just about money. Maybe this is tearing us apart." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Family isn't just about money," she said. "But what happens when money becomes the wedge that splits the family apart, when love and loyalty are weighed against greed and mistrust?" I stayed silent for a long time after that call. The truth is, I didn't want to let go. Not because I cared about the money for myself, but because this was about more than money. It was about standing up for Grandma's voice, her wishes, and for every child she cared about. The days that followed were filled with quiet determination. I started visiting local community centers, schools, shelters, places where kids struggled every day just to find a safe place to learn to play, to dream. I saw faces that reminded me of the stories Grandma told me, faces that deserved more than just empty promises. Using the inheritance to fund after-school programs, scholarships, food drives, it was my way of keeping Grandma's spirit alive. And every smile, every thank you felt like a small victory over the bitterness that lingered in my family. But the cost was high. Invitations stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. Photos of family gatherings appeared on social media without me in them, like I had become a ghost. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself flipping through an old photo album Grandma had given me. There, in faded pictures, were moments of laughter, hugs, and a family I once belonged to. The contrast between then and now was almost unbearable. Tears slipped down my cheeks. The ache of loss was more than just grief over Grandma's death. It was the grief of losing a family I thought I had. And yet, even in the darkest moments, I felt a flicker of something else. Hope. Hope that maybe one day, when the wounds had time to heal, the walls between us might come down. But until then, I carry this story with me, the story of betrayal, courage, and the power of holding on to what's right, even when the world around you seems ready to break. The fight isn't over. Not for me. Not for the children I'm trying to help. Not for the family I once knew. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to keep going. The silence from my family was deafening. Days turned into weeks, and still no calls, no messages, no attempts to reach out. It was as if the truth I had uncovered, the fight I'd fought not for greed, but for justice, had made me an enemy in the eyes of the people I once called family. But I refused to let that silence break me. I dove deeper into the work that Grandma had inspired. I partnered with local shelter schools and community centers, pushing to create programs for kids who had no one else. I wanted those children to feel the love and support Grandma had always dreamed of giving. The first event I organized was a small scholarship fund ceremony. I stood at the podium, my hands trembling, heart pounding. I looked out at the faces of kids who could barely contain their excitement. Some wore worn shoes. Others had clothes patched with "Love Not Money." But their eyes, those eyes, shone with dreams and hope. One little girl caught my attention. She was no older than 8, clutching a handmade card. Her smile shy but radiant. When she handed it to me after the ceremony, her words stuck deep in my heart. "Thank you for believing in us." In that moment, all the bitterness, the pain, the rejection faded. I realized why I had to fight so hard, not for the money, not for revenge, but for moments like these. But the deeper I got into this new purpose, the more I felt the weight of my fractured family pressing down. I still wasn't prepared for what came next, a message from my uncle. Just one text. Short, cold, and heavy with unsaid things. "We need to talk." My mind raced. Was this a truce, an apology, or another battle waiting to unfold? I agreed to meet hoping for answers for a bridge for closure. We met at a quiet coffee shop, a neutral ground. My uncle's face was harder than I remembered, lines of anger and regret etched deep. He looked at me not as a niece, but as a challenge. I didn't want it to come to this, he began, voice low. But you made this personal. You dragged family into the dirt. I swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words. I only wanted what Grandma wanted. What's fair? You chose to ignore her. He looked away, his jaw tightening. It's not that simple, Anna. And that's when the cracks in his armor showed. Behind the bitterness was something raw: fear, regret, maybe even sorrow. But he was too proud, too wounded to say it aloud. I wanted to reach out to bridge the gap, but the silence between us was thick, suffocating. That meeting left me shaken, but it also ignited something. A resolve to keep fighting, not just in court or in meetings, but for understanding, for truth, for a family torn apart. Because sometimes justice isn't just about the law. It's about healing wounds too deep for words, about piecing together fragments of trust shattered by greed and silence. And so I continued walking this tightrope between hope and despair, holding on to the belief that one day maybe family could mean more than just shared blood. Maybe it could mean forgiveness. Maybe it could mean love. But that day wasn't here yet. Not now. Not while the past still cast its long shadow over us all. The days after that meeting with my uncle felt like walking through a fog, every step uncertain, every breath heavy. His words haunted me, twisting around my thoughts. You made this personal. Wasn't this personal? How could it not be? When the people you once trusted become strangers, wrapped in silence, when the hands that should hold you instead push you away, personal is all it ever becomes. I found myself questioning everything. The memories of Grandma's laughter, the warm kitchen where she used to bake apple pies, the quiet evenings listening to her stories, were they just a backdrop to this family unraveling? Or were they the fragile threads holding what was left of us together? I remember sitting by the window one rainy afternoon, the droplets tracing patterns on the glass like a slow, silent heartbeat. I traced my finger over the handwritten letter Grandma left behind, the edges worn from countless readings. Her words, so clear, so simple, were a lighthouse in the storm: fairness, love, equality. I held on to that as if it were the last piece of home I had, but the ache in my chest wouldn't fade. It pressed down with every phone call unanswered, every gathering I wasn't invited to, every birthday passed in solitude. Family had become a place I longed for, but couldn't reach. Still, I refused to be swallowed by the bitterness. Instead, I poured myself deeper into the work I'd started, the programs for the kids who needed it most. The faces of those children became my armor, their hope, my fuel. One evening, after a long day organizing supplies for a community center, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, exhausted but restless. That's when I found the box Grandma had left for me, tucked away in the attic during my last visit. It was covered in dust and wrapped with a faded ribbon, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Inside were letters, photographs, and small keepsakes, pieces of her life and her love, a testament to the woman who had tried so hard to keep us together, even as we fell apart. Among the letters was one addressed to me, written in her shaky handwriting. My dearest Anna, if you're reading this, it means you are standing strong in the face of trials. Remember, family isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, sometimes painful. But love, real love, can heal wounds no matter how deep. Hold on to that and never lose sight of who you are. With all my heart, Grandma. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the letter. It was a lifeline, a reminder that no matter how fractured we were, I carried her love inside me. And with that love, maybe I could find a way forward. But the path ahead wasn't clear. The walls my family had built weren't going to crumble overnight. I felt the weight of loneliness and the sting of betrayal, but also a quiet strength growing within me. The kind that comes from knowing your worth even when others fail to see it. That night, I made a silent promise to keep fighting, not just for the money, not just for justice, but for healing, for the chance that someday, when the wounds have time to breathe, family might mean more than just blood, that it might mean forgiveness, that it might mean love. But for now, the silence remains, and I walk this path alone, holding on to hope in the face of broken ties and uncertain tomorrows. I never imagined that a single letter could carry so much weight. Grandma's words echoed in my mind over and over, weaving themselves into the fabric of my days and nights. Family isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, sometimes painful. But love, real love, can heal wounds no matter how deep. Those words became my compass, guiding me through the maze of anger, loneliness, and doubt that had settled deep inside me. But following that compass wasn't easy. Every time I tried to reach out, even in the smallest way, the silence stretched longer. My uncle and aunt had retreated into their fortress of resentment, and every bridge I attempted to build crumbled before it could fully take shape. It was as if admitting the truth meant admitting guilt, and pride doesn't bend easily. One afternoon, I sat on the worn bench in the park near my apartment, watching the children play under the soft Portland sun. Their laughter was bright and untethered, a sharp contrast to the heaviness I carried. I realized then why Grandma's dream mattered so much, not for the money itself, but for these moments, these sparks of joy that could ignite hope in places where it had long been forgotten. I took out my phone and started writing a piece for the local paper. Not about the fight over the will, not about the family drama, but about the children whose futures were being shaped by kindness, by community, by small acts of love. I wrote about the programs I had helped fund, about the kids who found safe spaces to learn and grow, about the power of generosity to heal invisible wounds. When the article was published, I wasn't prepared for the flood of responses. Emails poured in, stories from other families, from strangers, moved by the message from people who had once felt alone and forgotten. Their words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, reminding me that sometimes the family we choose extends far beyond bloodlines. But even as that new network of support grew, the old wounds festered. One evening, I received an unexpected message from my aunt. Her words were hesitant, almost fragile. "Can we talk?" I don't know how to say this, but maybe it's time. My heart raced. Was this the beginning of a real conversation, or a trap I debated for hours, the questions spinning in my mind like a storm? Finally, I replied. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, the kind with soft lighting and space to breathe. When she arrived, her eyes held a mixture of regret and hope. We talked not just about the will or the money, but about the years lost, the misunderstandings, the pain buried deep beneath pride. For the first time, she shared her fears, the pressure she felt to protect the family name, the guilt that had been locked away. I shared my own wounds, the loneliness, the sense of betrayal, and the fierce love for Grandma that kept me fighting. It wasn't a perfect conversation. There were silences heavy with unsaid words, tears that caught in throats, and moments where old defenses rose like walls. But it was a start. As I walked away that night, the air felt lighter, the future less daunting. I knew the road ahead was long, that forgiveness is a process, not a destination. But in that fragile moment of connection, I caught a glimpse of hope. The story of my family, the pain, the fight, the love was far from over. But maybe, just maybe, healing had begun. And with every step, I carried Grandma's letter close to my heart, a reminder that love, even when tested, can still find its way home. The weeks following that tentative meeting with my aunt felt like stepping into a new, uncertain light, fragile but promising. I held on to every small sign, every glance, every soft word exchanged like precious jewels, yet the weight of the past remained heavy between us. The walls, though cracked, still stood tall, but something had shifted. The silence that once felt like a chasm began to feel more like a gap navigable if only we could find the right path. Still, healing demanded more than words. It demanded reckoning with ourselves, with each other, and with the memories that both bind and burden. One afternoon, I found myself alone in Grandma's old house, the place where so much had begun, and in many ways where it all felt frozen in time. The furniture was covered in dust sheets. The air smelled faintly of lavender and worn paper. I ran my hand over the carved oak table where she used to sit, the same table that had held the will, the letter, the memories. I pulled out another letter from the box, the one Grandma had never sent. Her handwriting was shaky, her words filled with pain and hope all at once. If you're reading this, it means the world has been unkind and family has turned cold. But know this, even in the darkest times, love is the light that guides us home. Don't let anger or hurt harden your heart. Forgiveness is not for them, but for you. I let the words sink, deep tears streaming quietly. Forgiveness. The word felt like a fragile bridge stretched across a turbulent river, necessary, yet terrifying. The next morning, I found myself sitting across from my uncle again, the man who had been my greatest adversary and perhaps my most broken kin. He looked tired, the years of silence and bitterness etched into the lines on his face. Yet when our eyes met, there was a flicker perhaps of regret, or maybe of longing. "I've been thinking a lot," he said slowly, voice rough, "about Grandma, about us, about what we lost." I nodded, words caught in my throat. "I'm sorry, Anna, for everything, for shutting you out for the fight, for not seeing what really mattered until it was almost too late." His apology was raw, unpolished, but it carried the weight of truth. I took a breath, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. I'm sorry, too, for pushing when maybe I should have listened more. But I fought because I loved her, because I wanted her wishes honored. He reached across the table, hesitating, then finally grasped my hand. It was a small gesture, but it cracked the ice between us. From that moment, a fragile truce began to form, not just between us, but within me. Yet even as hope stirred, the path was far from clear. The family fractures ran deep. There were still voices in the shadows, whispers of resentment, fear, and old grudges threatening to pull us back into darkness. But for the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, the light of love and forgiveness could lead us forward. As I left that cafe holding my uncle's hand in mine, I looked up at the sky, a canvas streaked with fading gold and rising stars. And I knew the journey was just beginning. The days that followed our fragile reconciliation with my uncle unfolded like the slow dawn after a long, dark night, tentative, cautious, but undeniably real. The silence that had once separated us began to hum with the possibility of something new, understanding, maybe even healing. Yet beneath that cautious hope, an undercurrent of tension remained. The years of silence, of hurt and betrayal had left scars too deep to disappear overnight. Every conversation was a delicate dance. Words weighed carefully, emotions simmering just beneath the surface. I found myself revisiting Grandma's house, often the place where so many memories lingered like ghosts. Each visit was a pilgrimage, a chance to touch the past and try to understand the forces that had shaped us all. The air inside was thick with echoes, laughter, arguments, whispered secrets, and tears. One rainy afternoon, as the drops tapped softly against the window pane, I sat with a notebook in my lap, trying to put into words the storm inside me. How do you explain the ache of being cut out of your own family? The confusion when love turns to silence, the hope that flickers, even when everything tells you to give up. I wrote about Grandma, the heart of our family, the keeper of secrets and dreams, about the letter she left, a beacon for those of us lost in the darkness, about the promise I made to her to carry forward her legacy of love and fairness. But my thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was my aunt, hesitant and unsure. She stepped inside carrying a box of old photographs, faded images of family gatherings, birthdays, moments frozen in time. "I thought you might want these," she said softly. I took the box, fingers trembling. Each photo was a thread in the tapestry of our shared history. Smiles that hid pain, embraces that masked distance. Eyes that once held hope, now clouded by regret. We sat together in silence, the weight of unspoken words heavy between us. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry, Anna, for everything, for doubting you, for fighting you. Grandma's death, it broke something in all of us. But maybe it's not too late." Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. For the first time, the walls she'd built came down, and I saw the woman beneath the one who loved Grandma just as fiercely, just as painfully. I reached out, pulling her into an embrace. We cried together, the years of hurt and misunderstanding washing away in that moment. But as we pulled apart, I knew the road ahead was still long. Forgiveness was just the beginning. Rebuilding trust, repairing broken bonds. It would take time, patience, and a willingness to face the shadows of our past. That night, as I lay in bed, the photos spread out beside me. I realized something profound. Family isn't perfect. It's messy, painful, and complicated. But it's also resilient. It can bend without breaking, heal without forgetting. And maybe, just maybe, it can be the home we all long for, even when it feels out of reach. With that thought, I closed my eyes, ready to face whatever came next, carrying Grandma's love like a shield and a promise. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft and tentative, much like the fragile hope growing in my heart. That box of photographs my aunt had brought sat on the kitchen table, silent witnesses to a past we were only just beginning to face. Each image was a fragment, a smile, a glance, a moment that had been preserved but also distorted by time and silence. I ran my fingers over one photo, a faded picture of Grandma surrounded by all her grandchildren, their faces alight with joy. It was impossible to reconcile the warmth in that image with the cold distance that had defined our recent years. How had we let love slip through our fingers like sand? That question haunted me. The cracks in our family were wider than I had imagined, not just between me and my uncle or aunt, but within each of us, wounds carved by years of unspoken grievances and misunderstood intentions. I realized healing wouldn't be a straight path. It was a winding road filled with unexpected turns, moments of joy, and setbacks that threatened to pull us back into darkness. The next few days were a whirlwind of conversations, some tentative, others charged with emotion. I reached out to cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, sharing pieces of Grandma's letter and my vision for what our family could become. To my surprise, many responded not with anger, but with relief. Relief that someone was finally willing to speak the truth, to confront the shadows lurking in the corners of our history. One evening, I sat with my journal, pouring out thoughts I hadn't dared to say aloud. "Why is it so hard to forgive?" I wrote. Is it pride, fear, the pain of betrayal? And yet forgiveness feels like the only way forward, an act of courage, not weakness. As I closed my journal, a knock at the door startled me. It was my uncle holding a battered box of his own. "I found some things in Grandma's attic," he said, voice hesitant. "Maybe they can help us understand everything." We spent hours sifting through old letters, diaries, and mementos, each piece a clue to the woman who had held us together and in some ways torn us apart. Her words, her hopes, her fears all laid bare in the faded ink. Through those artifacts, I began to see Grandma not just as the matriarch of our family, but as a woman grappling with her own regrets and desires. A woman who knew the fragility of love and the strength it demanded. As the night deepened, so did our conversations, turning from the past to the present, from blame to understanding. But even as the walls between us softened, I could sense the lingering shadows. There were still unresolved hurt secrets that had yet to be shared, and the ever-present question of whether we could truly move beyond the pain. I looked around at my family, imperfect, wounded, yet striving, and felt a surge of both hope and apprehension. The journey ahead would test us all. But with every step I was learning that love is not a destination, it's a choice we make every day. And as I prepared to face whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. This story, our story, was far from over. The quiet hum of the early morning filled the room as I sat surrounded by the fragile pieces of my grandmother's life. Letters yellowed with age, photographs tinged with dust, and journals bursting with secrets long buried. Each artifact whispered fragments of a woman who had loved fiercely, but had also been caught in the tangled web of family pain and misunderstanding. As I traced the familiar curves of her handwriting, I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me. The hopes, the disappointments, the sacrifices that had shaped the woman she was and the family we had become. But beneath the sorrow, there was something else, a fierce determination, a refusal to let bitterness define us. I realized then that Grandma's story was not just hers, it was ours. And to honor her, we had to confront the past with courage and compassion. Later that day, I met with my uncle and aunt once again. The air between us was still heavy, but there was a new openness, an acknowledgement that we could no longer be prisoners of our own pain. "We can't change the past," my uncle said, voice steady but filled with emotion, "but we can choose how we move forward." His words echoed in the silence, a fragile bridge across the chasm that had separated us for so long. We spoke late into the night, sharing memories, both joyful and painful. For the first time in years, we listened not to defend, but to understand. Yet even as the walls came down, I sensed the lingering shadows, unspoken fears, and unresolved wounds that threatened to pull us back. One conversation in particular stayed with me. My aunt, her eyes glistening with tears, confessed the deep guilt she'd carried for years. "I thought cutting you out was protecting the family," she said, "but all it did was break us." Her words stirred something deep inside me, a mixture of sadness, empathy, and a cautious hope. I wanted to believe we could heal, but healing was not a single moment. It was a process, fragile and ongoing. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the true meaning of family, how it is not defined by perfection, but by the willingness to forgive, to listen, to love, despite the flaws. And as I walked through Grandma's garden, now wild and untamed, I saw a metaphor for our family, resilient, imperfect, but alive. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and tests of faith. But there was also a promise that no matter how deep the wounds, love could be, the force that binds us. And with that promise, I stepped forward, ready to write the next chapter of our story. The fragile thread of hope that had begun to weave its way through our family was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it promised a new beginning. Terrifying because the past still clung tightly like shadows, refusing to fade. In the quiet moments alone, I wrestled with the tumult inside me, the mixture of relief, anger, sorrow, and cautious optimism. How could I fully embrace this tentative peace when the wounds were so raw? How could I trust that this fragile truce would hold? The answer came slowly in the gentle reminders of my grandmother's presence. Her letters, her laughter echoing in my memory, her unwavering belief in the power of love and forgiveness. One afternoon, as I sat by the window, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass, I felt a profound shift within myself. I realized that healing was not about erasing the pain or pretending the past hadn't hurt. It was about carrying that pain with grace, letting it shape me, but not define me. I began to reach out, not just to family, but to others who had been touched by Grandma's kindness. The stories I heard were both heartwarming and heartbreaking, a testament to the woman she was and the legacy she left behind. With each story shared, my resolve grew stronger. I knew what I had to do. I started writing again, not just articles, but a deeper, more personal narrative about family loss and the power of forgiveness. I wanted the world to know that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. But this was just the beginning. There were still conversations left to have, wounds to heal, and truths to uncover. As I closed my laptop that night, a quiet determination settled over me. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be moments of doubt, of pain, and perhaps even of heartbreak. But I was ready, because sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet decision to keep moving forward. And so, with my grandmother's spirit guiding me, I stepped into the future, ready to face whatever came next. If you've been moved by this story, if you believe in the power of family and forgiveness, please subscribe to the channel. Join me as we continue to unravel this journey together, uncovering the truths, the heartbreaks, and the hope that lies ahead. There is so much more to come, and I want you to be there for every step.